Picture the world deep in the Ice Age, tens of thousands of years ago, long before farms, before cities, before writing, when much of the north was cold open grassland and walls of ice. For almost the entire time there have been people on Earth, there was more than one kind of person walking around on it. Not ancestors stacked in a neat line, one slowly turning into the next. Cousins. Other kinds of human, alive at the very same time as our own ancestors, sharing the same cold valleys and the same firewood, and, every so often, the same children. And then, around 40,000 years ago, all of them died out except one. Us. You have probably heard the wilder versions of this story. Somebody, somewhere in deep prehistory, made something that looks too clever or too advanced. And so people reach for aliens, or Atlantis, or a lost, super advanced civilization that rose, built something impossible, and vanished without bothering to leave a forwarding address. Tonight, we are going to talk about the real humans those stories are actually about. And the truth, the way it usually does, turns out to be stranger and better than the theories. So here is what we will get to. Who were these other humans? Were they really the hunched, grunting cave brute you often see them portrayed as? We lived through that same ice age and made it out to the other side. Why did they die out and we did not? How did they live their day-to-day lives? Did they think like the other humans that survived? Did they feel emotions like we do? And then the real mystery, the one we will end on. Are they actually gone? But before we dig into it, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if you already knew one of these lost cousins by name, Neanderthal, Denisovan, tell me down in the comments. I like hearing from those of you who are still awake. Now get yourself comfortable, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, tuck your feet in. We are going a long way back, past the pyramids, past the first farmers, past writing, past every city that has ever stood, to that wide, cold world where the human family was bigger than it is tonight. Picture the Earth a few 100,000 years ago. There was no one to write anything down, so for a long time nobody knew how crowded the family tree actually was. In Europe and across into Western Asia, there were the Neanderthals, stocky, strong, cold-weather people who would last for hundreds of thousands of years. Far to the east, across Siberia and down into Asia, there were the Denisovans, who we will get to and who we know existed from almost nothing. A sliver of finger bone and a few teeth. There was Homo erectus, the long-distance traveler of the family, who had already been around for over 1 million years. The steady older relative who got everywhere first. There was Homo heidelbergensis, who many researchers think was the shared ancestor that the Neanderthals and Denisovans both came from. On one Indonesian island, there were the people of Flores, so small that the scientists who found them nicknamed them hobbits. In South Africa, there was Homo naledi, small-brained, with a skull that looks far more ancient than it really is, because, awkwardly for the textbooks, it lived surprisingly recently. And in China, there is a huge, heavy skull they call Dragon Man. Reasonable enough question at this point. How many kinds of human is that? Counting loosely, somewhere around 7 to 9 of them overlapping across the last few 100,000 years. Not in a line, at the same time. There were stretches of prehistory when, if you walked far enough, you would have met people who were unmistakably human and just as unmistakably not your kind. And the closest of those lost cousins, the ones we know best, are the ones everybody thinks they already know and almost everybody pictures wrong. So let us start there. Say the word Neanderthal and a picture arrives whether you invite it or not. Hunched over, knuckles low, slack-jawed, dim, more gorilla-like than man. Here is where that picture came from, and it is a genuinely good example of how history gets things wrong. In the early 1900s, a French scientist named Marcelin Boule got hold of one of the best Neanderthal skeletons yet found, an old man from a cave called La Chapelle au Sein. Boule reconstructed him, and the man he built had bent knees, a stooped spine, and a head slung forward like he was sniffing the ground for his keys. That reconstruction went around the world. It became the Neanderthal for about 50 years. There was one small problem. The old man of La Chapelle had severe arthritis. His spine was bent because he was old and in pain, the way a spine sometimes is, even in modern history. Boule had taken one specific suffering man and drawn an entire kind of human in his shape. It is one of the most successful wrong ideas in the history of science. A single arthritic skeleton libeling a whole people for half a century. So let us put the real ones in front of you. Stand a Neanderthal up next to yourself, and the first surprise is how little surprise there is. The men stood around 5'5", the women a little over 5 foot, which is to say about the height of your average European a few centuries ago. Not towering, but not tiny either. They were stocky though, and barrel-chested, thick-boned, wide through the hips, built like someone who carries heavy things up hills for a living, which they did. The face is where you would actually notice the difference. A long, low skull, a heavy ridge of bone over the eyes, a forehead that sloped back, almost no chin, and a big, broad nose. A nose, for the record, larger than yours, not smaller. So much for the brutish, flat snout you might have pictured. And the brain behind all that was as large as ours and, in some of them, even larger. A small word on what color they were, because some people always want to make them all the same, but the evidence does not support it. Their genes point in several directions at once. Some carried a version of pale skin and red hair, a different mutation than modern redheads, but the same general idea, and some did not. So if you are picturing a whole tribe of identical pale gingers, undo that. And if you are picturing them all dark, undo that too. Picture a range, the way any group of people is a range. What they were not was stupid. Which brings us to the part everyone underestimates, an ordinary day. We'll talk about fire first, because fire is where the brute story dies fastest. The Neanderthals did not just keep a fire going. At one rock shelter in Spain, called Abric Romani, they built a row of hearths spaced out evenly along the wall, so the smoke would clear while people slept against the rock. That is not a lucky campfire. That is someone thinking about ventilation. They also gathered manganese dioxide, a black mineral, and added it to their tinder because it lowers the temperature wood needs to catch. We installed smoke alarms. They ran chemistry experiments on their kindling. Same instinct, a very long time apart. Their tools were not bashed rocks either. They used a method scientists call the Levallois technique, where you carefully shape a stone core first, planning the flake you want before you ever strike it off. You have to see the finished blade in your head before it exists. And they made glue, real glue, birch-bark tar, which you only get by heating bark to a precise high temperature with almost no air. The kind of process that is genuinely hard to pull off even when you know what you are doing. They were hafting stone points onto wooden spears with adhesive. They cooked themselves. They hunted, and they hunted big. The arm bones of Neanderthal men show the kind of wear you would expect from rodeo riders. The marks of grabbing hold of something large and powerful at close range and not letting go. At one site in Germany, they were systematically taking down straight-tusked elephants, animals bigger than any elephant alive today. This is cooperative, planned, dangerous work done by people who clearly trusted each other to hold the line. And they ate well, with what you could honestly call regional cuisine. On the coast at Gibraltar, they ate mussels and monk seals and dolphins and seabirds. Inland, foragers at a Spanish cave called El Cedron were eating pine nuts, mushrooms, moss, and bitter plants like yarrow and chamomile. The sort of herbs you only put in your mouth on purpose if somebody taught you what they are for. They roasted, they smoked, and they boiled food. At one cave in France, there is evidence they were curing and storing meat to get through winter. These were people who thought about February when it was only October. For shelter, they liked a south-facing cave when they could get one, and when they could not, they built. In Ukraine, there are huts framed from mammoth bones. And in one cave in France called Bruniquel, more than 170,000 years ago, somebody went deep underground, far past any daylight, broke off stalagmites and arranged them into 2 careful rings. A couple of tons of stone, stacked on purpose by firelight in the dark, for a reason we still do not know. That one is worth lying awake on, except you are trying to do the opposite. So file it under people, not brutes, and we will move on. So yes, they were capable people. But capable is not the same as having an inner life, and the inner life is where this gets genuinely moving. So here is the evidence that they had one. They wore color. Neanderthals collected red ochre and black manganese and ground them into pigment. And the simplest reason to grind pigment is to put it on yourself or on something that matters to you. At a site in Croatia, they made jewelry out of eagle talons, selected them, cut them, strung them around 130,000 years ago, which is tens of thousands of years before our kind even shows up in Europe to supposedly teach anyone anything. They pierced and painted shells. They plucked the dark flight feathers out of birds of prey, which is a fussy thing to do unless you want them for show. There is cave art, too. Red hand stencils and dots on cave walls in Spain that some dating puts at more than 64,000 years old. If those dates hold, the art is older than any modern human in Europe, which would make it Neanderthal work. But the dates are disputed. Many researchers think the Neanderthals made those marks. Others think the dating is shaky, and it is not settled either way. You do not actually need the paintings, though, because you already have the talons, and the ochre, and the feathers, and 2 tons of stalagmites stacked in the dark at Bruniquel. Put it together, and a person comes into focus. Someone who painted their own body, marked their own walls, and made something beautiful when it did not need to be beautiful to do its job. That is not the behavior of an animal getting through the day. That is somebody who knows they are a person. And people who know they are people tend to have feelings about each other, which is the warmest part of the whole story, so let us go there next. In a cave in Iraq called Shanidar, they found a man scientists nicknamed Nandy. He had not had an easy life, to put it lightly. At some point, a heavy blow to the head had blinded him in one eye. One of his arms was withered and useless, probably amputated below the elbow. He had lost much of his hearing. Any one of those, in a world of cooperative big game hunting, should have been the end of him fairly quickly. He lived into his 40s. You do not live into your 40s one-eyed and one-armed in an ice age, unless other people decide, year after year, that you are worth feeding and worth carrying. Somebody made that decision about Nandy for a very long time. He is not the only one. Neanderthal skeletons routinely show serious injuries that healed, bones that were broken and then knitted back together, which takes weeks of someone else doing your hunting and your hauling for you. There is even a tooth from one Siberian cave with a cavity that looks deliberately scraped out with a stone tool, which, if it holds up, is about the oldest dentistry anyone has found. Make of that what you will at this hour. They buried their dead, and they were tender about it in ways that are hard to read as anything but grief. A baby laid in the ground with a single flint blade placed on its chest. Another small grave ringed with the horns of wild goats. Whatever those gestures meant exactly, and we cannot fully know, they were gestures. Somebody arranged them on purpose. Now you may have heard the most famous version of Neanderthal tenderness, that at Shanidar they buried a man on a bed of flowers because clumps of flower pollen turned up in his grave. It is a lovely idea, and you should hold it loosely. Some researchers believe his people really did lay flowers with him. Others think small burrowing animals or bees carried that pollen down into the soil long afterward, and there were never any flowers at all. The honest answer is that we do not know. But notice, you do not need the flowers. The care is already proven by Nandy, who lived 20 hard years he could not possibly have managed alone. The flowers would be lovely. The kindness is a fact either way. There were families, in the plain sense of the word. In one Siberian cave, the DNA tells you exactly who was there. A father, his teenage daughter, and a couple of close relatives. A household dead together, tens of thousands of years ago. And there were children who were just children. On a beach in southern Spain, pressed into old mud and then preserved, there are footprints of small Neanderthal feet that were not walking anywhere in particular. They were jumping, running, doubling back, messing about at the edge of the water the way small feet do. 100,000 years ago, and some kid would not settle down. That is who Europe lost. Hold that picture, because now we go east, to the cousins we can barely see at all. Here is a sentence that should not be possible. We discovered an entire kind of human before we had any idea what their face looked like. That is the Denisovans, and they are the strangest thing in this whole strange story. It starts in 2008 in a cave in the Siberian mountains called Denisova, with a single chip of bone from the tip of a young girl's little finger, small enough to lose in your palm. For a couple of years, it sat in a drawer, an unremarkable scrap as far as anyone could tell. Then in 2010, a team pulled DNA out of it. And the DNA did not match us, and it did not match the Neanderthals. It belonged to a kind of human nobody had ever named, recognized for the very first time, not from a skull or a skeleton, but from the genetic code inside one finger bone. We met them by reading them. Since then, the haul has grown, and it is still almost nothing. A few teeth, a piece of a jaw found high on the Tibetan Plateau, fragments scattered as far as Laos and possibly Taiwan. From that handful of bones and a great deal of DNA, this is roughly what scientists can say. They were spread across an enormous stretch of Asia, including the brutal, cold and thin air of the Tibetan high country. Their DNA points to dark skin, dark hair, dark eyes. The one good piece of skull suggests an even heavier brow than a Neanderthal's, a wide flat face, and very large molars. And that is close to the edge of what we honestly know. We cannot yet look a Denisovan clearly in the face. The missing face is part of the mystery. And then there is the bracelet. In Denisova Cave, they found a band of polished green stone, drilled clean through with a hole so neat that when it first turned up, it was assumed to be far more recent, only a few thousand years old, because surely nobody that ancient worked stone that precisely. Except the layer of the cave it came from is genuinely old. So who made it? And here I have to stop you before the word Denisovan settles too comfortably, because scientists honestly argue about this. That cave was lived in by different kinds of human across enormous spans of time. The bracelet might be Denisovan work. It might be the work of early modern humans. We do not know who drilled it. What we do know is sharper and more interesting than a tidy answer. This one cold cave in Siberia was a crossroads, used and reused by more than one kind of human, and one of them, we are not sure which, could do beautiful, careful work. A vanished people we know from a single finger bone and a few teeth. A finely made object with no certain maker. This, right here, is exactly the kind of gap the wild stories rush in to fill. So let us talk about the wild stories. When a story has a hole in it this shape, clever objects, missing faces, a whole kind of human gone, people reach for something to fill it. And the things they reach for are always, suspiciously, the most exciting things on offer. So you will hear that aliens did it, that ancient visitors from space handed over the technology, drilled the bracelet, built whatever looks too advanced, and left. You will hear it was Atlantis, a lost, perfect civilization sunk beneath the sea, whose survivors taught the savages a few tricks before disappearing. You will hear, dressed up more politely, that there was a forgotten super race, advanced beyond anyone around them, who rose and fell and got scrubbed out of the record. Let me be plain, because this channel will not trade these for the truth. There is no evidence for any of it. None. No spaceship, no sunken city, no secret master race. These are not theories in the way scientists use the word. They are good campfire stories wearing a lab coat. And here is the part the campfire stories never tell you, the part that is actually better. You do not need aliens to explain the bracelet, because ordinary ancient humans already drilled stone, cooked tar, planned hunts, and stacked stalagmites in the pitch dark. You do not need a lost super race to explain how clever these people were, because the savages in the story were the engineers all along. Every time someone hands the credit to spacemen, they are taking it away from a real person who sat in a real cave and worked something difficult out with their own hands. The wild theories think they are making prehistory more amazing. They are doing the opposite. The amazing part is that this was us, the whole scattered, struggling, inventive human family, with nobody helping. The honest mysteries are stranger, and they are real. We genuinely do not know who made the bracelet. We genuinely cannot draw a Denisovan's face. And we genuinely are not sure why, after all of this, the other humans went away and we did not. That last one is the real question, and it does not have a spaceship in it. It has something more like weather and numbers and bad luck. Let us go through it properly. Around 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals and the Denisovans fade out of the record, and we are still here to wonder why. There is no single answer, and anyone who gives you one is selling something. What scientists have instead is a list of pressures, and the honest picture is that several of them landed at once. Here is the list, laid out fairly, with nobody crowned. Theory 1. The climate turned on them. Right around that window, the Ice Age threw some of its worst punches. Vicious cold swings, a giant volcanic eruption in Italy, and a strange spell when the Earth's magnetic field weakened. Hard times. But here is the catch. The Neanderthals had already survived 250,000 years of ice. They were the cold weather experts. The climate squeezed them. Few scientists think it finished them on its own. Theory 2. Competition with us. Their disappearance lines up closely with modern humans arriving in their lands. Scientists estimate we may have outnumbered them by something like 10 to 1, with slightly broader toolkits and wider trading networks that reached between groups. Notice the framing, though. Not because they were dim brutes who lost a fair fight, because there were simply more of us, better connected. Numbers and networks, not stupidity. Theory 3. There were never many of them to begin with. Scientists estimate the entire Neanderthal breeding population across all of Europe and Asia at only a few thousand individuals at any one time. Small, scattered bands. Theory 4. And because the bands were small and scattered, they bred with close relatives. The late Neanderthal genomes show it plainly. Close kin having children together, the genetic variety narrowing, birth defects piling up at sites like El Cidron. A small population is a fragile one. One bad stretch of luck it cannot recover from. Theory 5. Disease. When our kind came up out of Africa, we likely carried illnesses these isolated groups had never met and had no defense against. The same grim story that has played out between separated peoples many times since. There is also a stranger, fringe idea floating around that a mad cow-type brain disease spread by eating the dead may have helped finish them off. I mention it because it is genuinely published, but treat it as one odd theory among many, not as fact. Theory 6. Small populations again, but as raw arithmetic. With high infant mortality and short lives, scientists estimate a single band could be wiped out by a few bad winters in a row. There was very little margin for error. Theory 7. The squeeze on food. Big bodies need a lot of calories, and they leaned on big game. As the climate lurched and the great herds thinned out, they were competing for shrinking meat against modern humans on one side and cave lions and hyenas on the other. So which was it? It was probably a mix. The weather and the numbers and the inbreeding and the newcomers and the bad winters, more or less together. A fragile, dwindling, capable people met a sudden, crowded, changing world, and they did not have the spare margin to absorb it. There is no villain to point at. That is the truth, and it sits more easily than a tidy one. A slow narrowing of the human world, until the family was down to one. Except vanished turns out to be the wrong word, because they did not all simply die. Some of them did something else, and it is the best thing in this episode. For a long time, the question was, did we kill them off? And the answer that has come back, written in our own bodies, is gentler and far better than murder. We did not only replace the other humans, we absorbed them. The old line was extinction. The truer line is that they did not all die out. Some of them became us. When the genome of a Neanderthal was finally sequenced, there was a shock waiting in it. People outside Africa today carry a small but real amount of Neanderthal DNA, somewhere around 1 to 4% in nearly everyone. This is not a metaphor. It is actual Neanderthal genetic code, copied forward generation after generation, sitting in the cells reading these words. And the Denisovans, the cousins we can barely see, left their mark too, across the islands of Melanesia, in Papua New Guinea, in Aboriginal Australians, people carry several percent Denisovan DNA, with one group in the Philippines carrying the most of anyone on Earth. And these stretches of old DNA are not dead, silent passengers. Some of them still do real work in the body. The gene that lets people on the Tibetan Plateau live and breathe easily at heights where the air would leave the rest of us gasping. That gene came from the Denisovans, handed across to our species and still keeping people alive up there today. A cluster of genes for skin and hair, built for a colder world, came down from the Neanderthals. Pieces of our immune systems were borrowed from both. The other humans are not only in the ground, they are switched on, doing useful work in billions of people right now. And then there is one little girl who makes the whole thing real. Back in Denisova Cave, among thousands of plain, nondescript bone scraps, there was a fragment about the size of the top joint of your finger. A graduate student named Samantha Brown was screening pile after pile of these fragments, looking for anything human, and an early batch had come back with nothing. She kept going anyway. This one came back human. When the geneticists sequenced it, they got a result so strange they assumed they had made a mistake in the lab and ran it again. They had not made a mistake. The bone belonged to a girl who died around 13 years old, about 90,000 years ago. Her mother was a Neanderthal. Her father was a Denisovan. She was a first-generation child of two different kinds of human, the only one ever found. Scientists call her Denny. For one childhood, 90,000 years ago, two of the lost branches of the family were not branches on a chart at all. They were a mother and a father and a daughter. And that little girl's finger bone waited 90,000 years in the dark to tell us so. A careful note, because it matters and because the honest version is the better one. Denny does not prove the different kinds of human mixed all the time. If anything, their DNA stayed distinct enough that constant mixing looks unlikely. She is not a statistic. She is one real child who happened to be made of both and who lasted long enough as a chip of bone to put a face, or at least a family, on the whole idea. So, are they gone? The Neanderthals are gone as a people. The Denisovans are gone as a people. There is no band of them over the next ridge, no hidden valley, whatever the late-night stories wish were true. In that sense, yes. The world really did narrow to one kind of human, and we are the one. But not gone the way you thought an hour ago, before any of this. When somebody on the high plateau of Tibet takes an easy breath in air that would flatten the rest of us, that is a Denisovan gene, still here, doing its job. When someone's skin holds up to a hard winter on genes shaped in the Ice Age, that is the Neanderthals, still here. They are not a separate people anymore. They are folded into ours, written into the bodies of billions, so quietly that almost no one carrying them knows their name. The other humans did not all vanish. Some of them made it the only way anyone really makes it through deep time, by becoming part of whatever came next. For most of the human story, the earth was not empty of other people. It held more than one kind of us at once. The strong, cold country Neanderthals of the western caves, the half-known Denisovans of the eastern mountains, the small folk on their island of Flores, and the far-walking travelers who reached the far side of the world before anyone else. They made fire and glue and jewelry. They buried their children and carried their injured elders, and then, one by one, all of them but us died out. And the one kind that remained turned out to be carrying pieces of all the others the whole time. That is a good thing to know as you let the day go. Not that you are anything in particular tonight, only that you are the latest of a very long, very crowded family, and the ones who came before are nearer than they look. The lights are already low. The blanket is where it should be. Your feet are warm. There is nothing left to figure out tonight. The other humans have kept their secrets for 40,000 years, and they will keep them until tomorrow. Rest now. We will be here again with another long way back when you wake. Hello again, friends. Tonight we're going downstairs, all the way downstairs, into an ancient underground city in the heart of Turkey that held as many as 20,000 people, 18 stories below the ground, and was built by people who never bothered to leave a name. Before we do anything else, before I even tell you to get comfortable, let's ask a few questions. Who digs an 18-story building downward and then leaves no record of who they were or why they did it. People nowadays carve their initials into park benches for far less. How do you keep 20,000 people breathing under a hillside with no machines, no electricity, and no windows? Why did the front door need to weigh as much as a small car? Who were they trying to keep out? Where do you put 1,000,000 baskets of rubble so that nobody passing by ever suspects a thing? What were these people so afraid of that down felt safer than up? How does a town forget, for 40 years, that it is sitting on the largest underground city ever found? And, on a practical note, what exactly do you do with the cows? We'll get to all of it soon, including the cows. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if there's a place or a story you'd like to fall asleep to some night, leave it in the comments. Tonight's subject is an 18-story hole in the ground, so I can promise you no suggestion is too strange. While you're down there in the comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. No judgment if it's late. That's what this channel was made for. And tonight, staying up a little too late counts as research. Now, dim the lights, pull the blanket up, and tuck those feet in. Get low and comfortable. Tonight, low is the whole point. And now, congratulations. You've just woken up in Cappadocia, in central Anatolia, somewhere around the year 850. You have a wool cloak, a borrowed mule, a letter for a man in the next village, and a road that runs straight across a wide, dry plain under an enormous grey sky. The village is ahead of you. You can see its rooftops. What you cannot see, what nobody passing through here could see, is the other village, the one underground. Because by the time you ride in, calling your hellos, the streets will be empty, the doors will be shut, and an entire town will have vanished into the earth beneath your mule's feet, holding its breath, waiting politely for you to leave. Welcome to Derinkuyu. Try not to take the silence personally. Let's start the story where the modern world starts, with a man, a house, and a home improvement project that was about to become an archaeological mega-event. It's 1963 in the town of Derinkuyu, in the Turkish province of Nevşehir. A local man is renovating his home. We have no idea what his name was, and we never will, but he's still about to go down in history. I want to be honest with you up front, because that's how we do things here. No newspaper recorded him, no report names him, and every version of this story we have was written down decades later. The tour guides at the site will tell you a better version, that his chickens kept slipping through a crack in the cellar and not coming back, and the man, reasonably enough, went in searching for the lost chickens. It's a wonderful story. It is also, as far as anyone can trace it, just a story. Guide lore, polished by retelling, the way all good doorways into history get polished. What the sober version says is this: the man knocked through a wall, and behind the wall there was a room he had no record of, in a house he thought he knew, and at the back of that room a passage, and the passage went down. Now the renovation itself was going about the same way all renovations go. Most home improvement surprises usually get chalked up to bad wiring and the previous owner's questionable decisions. In this case, the previous owner's questionable decision was a full-blown underground city. Behind the unknown man's wall was a tunnel. Beyond the tunnel were rooms. Below the rooms, even more tunnels. Stairs, shafts, halls, storerooms, descending level after level after level into the dark, further than a lamp could throw light, further than anyone was initially willing to go. The wall, for its part, had been holding this information since before the Ottoman Empire, and had apparently been waiting for someone to install a more modern floor plan before revealing its secrets. Within a few years, Turkey's Ministry of Culture had crews mapping it. By the end of the decade, visitors were climbing down into it. The records disagree on the exact year it opened, which feels right for a place this committed to secrecy. And what the mapping found was that the man's basement was not a basement at all. It was actually the attic of a city that went down a further 18 floors. Now, let's take the walk the first surveyors took and get our bearings, because the scale of this place is the first thing that's likely to blow your mind. Picture those first crews in the 60s, all carrying lamps, measuring tapes, a ball of string, and a completely inadequate sense of what they were walking into. Down the first set of stairs were rooms, reasonable enough. Down the second, halls, store chambers, a stable, less reasonable. Down the third, the fourth, the fifth, kitchens with black ceilings from ancient soot, a well shaft falling away past the lamplight, corridors running out in every direction like sentences with no end. Somewhere around the point where the surface noise stopped entirely, it would have dawned on each of them, personally and privately, that the word cave was no longer doing the necessary work. Caves happen naturally. Whatever this was not natural at all. Derinkuyu descends roughly 85 meters into the earth. That's around 280 feet. An 18-story building, upside down. If you stood it on the surface, it would be a respectable tower. But as we already know, they buried it. Spread through those levels were living chambers, kitchens, storerooms, stables, a winery, an oil press, communal dining halls, a school, chapels, wells, and something like 600 entrances, most of them hidden into the houses and courtyards of the town above. Not one grand gate. 600 quiet doors, cleverly disguised as somebody's cellar, somebody's stable corner, somebody's perfectly innocent storeroom floor. Every book and every article will tell you Derinkuyu could shelter 20,000 people, along with their livestock and their food. It's a famous number. It is also a number that nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever been able to trace to an actual study. No surveyor's calculation, no researcher's name attached. It's a figure that gets repeated because it keeps being repeated, which is the kind of thing that ought to make a careful person's eyebrow rise about half an inch. What we can say is that the rooms are real, the levels are real, the scale is genuinely enormous, and whether the true number was 20,000 or just 10, the achievement doesn't get less impressive. Today, only about 1/10 of it is open to visitors. The rest is closed, unexcavated, unlit, or simply not safe to wander around in. Which means the most photographed underground city on Earth is still Mostly a dark place where no one is allowed to go. To understand how any of this was possible, you have to go back, well before the diggers came along, to the actual landlords. There were three of them called Mount Erciyes, Mount Hassan, and Gurladar. And if you're thinking those are odd names, it's because they are volcanoes. Millions of years ago, in eruption after eruption, they buried this corner of Anatolia under colossal blankets of hot ash. The ash settled, compacted, and hardened into a rock called tuff. And Cappadocian tuff is a peculiar, generous material. It's soft. Soft enough that a determined person with hand tools, a pick, a scraper, and a little bit of patience, can carve a room out of it the way you'd carve a very stubborn cheese. No iron machinery required. No engineering degree needed. Just time and a slightly delusional willingness to spend it on such a project. And then the rock does something almost courteous. Exposed to air, it hardens. The fresh-cut surface dries, the minerals knit together, and your soft, carvable cheese develops a crust, a tougher skin that holds its shape, which is why tunnels cut more than 1,000 years ago are still standing today without a single support beam. The rock heals around the wound you made in it, and then holds the shape of that wound forever, like the world's most cooperative scar. This is the same geology that built the famous fairy chimneys on the surface, those tall, impossible stone spires that make Cappadocia look like a planet doing an impression of a fever dream. Wind and rain sculpted the rock from above. People sculpted it from within. The volcanoes, having supplied the material, kept a respectful distance and took no further credit. Before we ask who did this, let's sit with the harder question for a minute. How does anyone do this? Because digging down is not like building up. Building up, your materials arrive and stay put. Digging down, every single basketful of what you remove has to travel the other way. Up the stairs you just carved, out a door you're trying to keep secret, to somewhere it won't be noticed. Carve an 18-story city and you produce a mountain's worth of crumbled stone. And here's the lovely, maddening detail. Nobody has ever found the mountain. There's no great heap of soil squatting beside Derinkuyu announcing that something enormous happened here. Most likely it went onto the fields, a basket at a time, spread too thin for anyone to ever notice. That's just a guess though. No record actually survives. The builders even tidied up the evidence of building. The crime scene of the construction was cleaned before history arrived. Then there's the matter of planning. There were no blueprints, or at least none survived. And yet the shafts run true through 18 floors. The levels connect where they should. The air flows where it must. You cannot achieve that by enthusiasm alone. Somebody, many somebodies across generations, held the shape of this thing in their heads, in the dark, by lamplight, and handed that shape onto children who kept carving in the same directions. We don't know how they measured. We don't know how they kept the levels from wandering into each other. We know only that they didn't, for 85 vertical meters. There are modern basements with worse alignment, and those came with paperwork. And all of it was done by lamp, which, in a confined and barely ventilated working face, is its own quiet arithmetic. A flame eats the same air a digger does. They budgeted for oxygen the same way builders budget for timber. Patience, precision, and a suspicious knack for secrecy, all sustained across lifetimes. Hold that thought, because it's about to make the next question worse. So, who can we thank for breaking ground, literally, on what was to become such a great architectural achievement? And here the story splits into two questions. Who turned a hole in the ground into an 18-story city? That one we can actually answer, and we will in a minute. But who dug the first room? Who started all of it? That is the mystery. Here is the honest answer, and it is that nobody knows who the first diggers were. It's not that scholars are still debating the details. Genuinely, nobody knows who cut the first room at Derinkuyu or when. The version you'll read most often credits the Phrygians, an Iron Age Anatolian people, somewhere around the 8th or 7th century before Christ. It's a reasonable theory. It is also, when you chase it down, a theory resting on regional history and educated inference, not on an excavation report. No dated dig, no published stratigraphy. Some writers reach further back still, to the Hittites, around 1200 BC, under attack and digging in. Possible, argued by a few, proven by none. And Turkey's own Ministry of Culture, on its official page, skips both and traces the town's first inhabitants to Assyrian trading colonists, merchants from nearly 4,000 years ago. 3 official-sounding answers from 3 respectable directions, agreeing on almost nothing. There's even a celebrity witness who usually gets dragged into this. The Greek soldier historian Xenophon, writing around 400 BC, described Anatolian villagers living in houses dug underground. He said, "With a mouth like that of a well, but spacious below, with the livestock down there too, ladders for the people and tunnels for the animals." It's a marvelous passage, and it's real. I'll just note, because accuracy is the house rule. He wrote it about Armenia, a region away to the east. The oldest written description of underground living in Anatolia describes somewhere else. History does this to us constantly. So, whoever began building this underground city never took credit for it. No inscription, no founder's mark. Not even a, "Hey guys, check out this cool hole I'm digging over here." Every other wonder of the ancient world comes with a signature, because every other wonder was built to be seen. This one wasn't. Being known was the one thing this place could never afford. And so the first builders in the story signed nothing, told nobody, and left. So whoever began the digging is still a mystery. Although we may never know who cut the first room, we do know who cut the other 18 stories. And we know exactly why. From roughly the 7th century after Christ, Cappadocia became a frontier. The Byzantine Empire held Anatolia. The new Arab caliphates rode against it, and the wide land in between, farms, villages, monasteries, this plain, became the corridor the armies used. The raids began around 641, and then they kept coming, most summers, for the better part of 300 years. Read that again slowly. Not a war that happened to a generation, a war that happened to every generation, arriving with the warm weather, like the worst migratory bird imaginable. You couldn't fight a passing army. That was the emperor's job, and the emperor was in Constantinople, which had walls. You couldn't flee. The farm was the whole of what you had. So the people of this plain arrived at a third answer, the one that still stuns engineers today. If safety will not come from the sword or the road, dig. The expansion was the work of Byzantine Christian communities, level under level under level, across generations. Chapels appeared down there, Greek inscriptions, storerooms scaled for whole seasons. We picture ancient construction as kings pointing at things and slaves suffering. This was the opposite. Ordinary villagers deepening their own refuge, a basket of rubble at a time, fathers handing unfinished tunnels to sons the way other families hand down a trade. We baby-proof the staircase and call it preparedness. These people raid-proofed a county. So let's run the drill. Let's watch the vanishing act this whole machine existed to perform. The one you rode your mule into at the top of the hour. Picture this. A summer morning on the plain, looking very ordinary in every direction. Bread in the ovens, animals in the lanes, someone arguing with their neighbor about a fence. The immortal soundtrack of village life. Then, on the horizon, the thing every generation here learned to read before it learned letters. Dust. A column of it, billowing in a way that couldn't just be the wind and moving too fast to be blamed on a stampede of sheep. It was riders. Now, we don't have the drill manual. No pages survived telling us who moved first or who carried what. But the underground bunker itself was the emergency response plan, written in stone. 600 entrances, scattered through the houses, meaning nobody had far to run. Stables just under the surface, with wide passages, meaning the animals went down early and easily, not last and panicking. Provisions already below, grain, oil, water, wine, meaning the families fled with their hands free or carrying only children. The architecture assumes a calm, practiced retreat. It was designed around people who had done this before and expected to do it again. The whole town drains downward, lane by lane, house by house, like water finding its level. Last of all, somewhere in a back chamber, the groan of andesite on tuff, as the stones roll across the throats of the city and seat themselves and stop. And then, the part I find genuinely eerie. The riders arrive, and there is nothing wrong with the village, except that it's empty. Hearths warm, wells in the courtyards, not a soul, not even a single goat or chicken. Some of them must have known. By the 2nd century of this, surely the raiders knew about the holes. But knowing is not finding, and finding is not breaching. And a man who follows a tunnel mouth down into the dark meets a low passage, a blind turn, and half a ton of stone with a fist-sized hole in it, on the far side of which several thousand people are being very, very quiet. When your world fills with riders, every wall you can build above ground is an argument. Depth is the only answer that ends the conversation. Now to the detail everyone falls in love with, and rightly so, the doors. At choke points throughout the city, stairways, tunnel mouths, the necks between levels. The builders cut huge circular slabs of stone, like millstones stood on edge, 1 meter to 1.5 meters across, several hundred kilograms each, the heaviest ones weighing closer to a furniture removal van rather than a door. They sat in carved slots beside the passage, and when trouble came, the defenders rolled them across the opening where they settled into place, and the conversation with whoever was outside was abruptly over. And here's the elegant part. The doors could only be opened and closed from the inside. From the defender's side, handholds, leverage, room to work. From the attacker's side, a flat, round, faintly smug wall of stone with nothing to grip. The whole argument of the city condensed into a single object. We are not coming out, and you are not coming in. Better still, the builders carved the doors from andesite, a much harder volcanic rock than the soft tuff surrounding them on the walls, ceiling, and floors. They knew their materials well enough to make the wall yielding and the door unyielding, which is exactly backwards from every castle ever built. Each level could be sealed off on its own. Lose the first floor and the city didn't fall. It simply shrugged, rolled the next stone, and became one story smaller for a while. In the middle of most doors, there's a small round hole about the width of your fist, the observation port, a speaking tube, and, when required, something else. A Cambridge scholar named Dawkins, who walked these villages a century ago, collecting their dying Greek dialect, recorded a detail from the old stories. An arrow shot clean through the hole in one of those doors into the man on the other side. The hole was a courtesy with conditions. Here is the question that you should find the most puzzling while you lie there under your nice, breathable blanket. 18 floors down, no windows, no machines. Why didn't everyone simply suffocate? Because the city breathed. It was built breathing. More than 50 ventilation shafts drop through Derinkuyu. Straight, narrow chimneys, some running the full height of the city, top to bottom, like the building's own lungs. Warm, stale air rises and spills out. Cool air slides down to replace it, and the difference keeps a slow, continuous draft whispering through chambers 17 stories below the nearest blade of grass. No fans, no power, just physics, hired for free and never once late for work. The deepest shaft falls 55 meters and did double duty. Air above, water below, where it reached the water table and became the city's well. And the well held the city's quietest piece of genius. Its mouths opened on the lower levels, where the people were, and could be sealed off from above. A besieging army on the surface couldn't reach the water to poison it, couldn't drop anything down it, couldn't even reliably find it among fields and rooftops. The town's name, by the way, Derinkuyu, is Turkish for deep well. The secret was hiding in the name the entire time. Picture the besiegers' situation for a moment, because it deserves sympathy, almost. Your enemy has vanished into a hillside. Every door is a stone wheel you cannot move. Somewhere under your boots, thousands of people are drinking cool well water and breathing fresher air than your own camp, where the horses are thirsty and the summer is hot. You came to raid a village, and although you don't know it, the village is winning. So the doors are rolled shut, the lamps are lit. What is life actually like down there? First, the part I promised, the cows. The livestock lived on the topmost levels, just under the surface. And the reasons are so practical you can hear the town elders chuckling at your bewilderment. Reason 1. Smell, and everything the word implies in a sealed building. Keep the animals up where the vents are shortest, downwind of precisely nobody. Reason 2, and this is the one I find quietly beautiful. Warmth. A floor of cattle and sheep up top made a layer of living insulation between the cold surface and the families below. The city wore its cows like a beanie in the winter. Below the animals, everything a paused world requires. A winery, proper carved pressing basins, because if you're sealing yourself into a hill for an unknown stretch of time, wine stops being a luxury and becomes a morale booster. An oil press for the lamps. Light down there was lamplight or nothing. Storerooms for grain. Communal kitchens. Shared hearths. Their smoke channeled up through the vents and bled out quietly above, so the hillside wouldn't stand there visibly exhaling soup fumes. Long refectory halls where, presumably, whole streets worth of neighbors ate together. A village dinner table, 80 feet down. As for the other end of the digestive question, since you were about to ask, the tour guides would tell you sealed clay jars, and the guides are probably right, and that's all I want to say about that. The temperature, year-round, sits near a constant 13 degrees or so. Cellar weather. Cool, never freezing, in a land where the surface does both extremes with enthusiasm. And the honest asterisk, because that's the house style. Nobody lived down there permanently. This was not a mole civilization. The town, it was called Malacopia then, lived in the sun, farmed, kept bees, argued about ordinary things. The city below was the held breath, not the life. When riders showed up on the horizon, the whole town poured downstairs, sealed the stones, and waited. For weeks, if they had to. The wine cellars say they were provisioned for months. How long was the longest stay? We don't know. There are no records, remember? What we do know is the design assumed patience, and the design was used for a very, very long time. Down at the bottom of the visitable city, past the kitchens, below the storerooms, on the deepest level tourists ever reach, there is a church. It's carved in the shape of a cross, not decorated with one, shaped like one. Two long, vaulted halls crossing each other, cut as a single piece out of the living rock, roughly 25 meters end to end. Nothing about it is accidental. Somebody planned a cathedral floor plan in absolute darkness at the bottom of an inverted 18-story building, and then removed every cubic inch of stone that wasn't church. Think about what it means that it's down there, the deepest point, the last refuge behind the last door, when everything above you has gone wrong. Raiders in the upper levels, stones rolled, the whole town sealed and silent in the dark. The place the builders prepared for you is a sanctuary. The bottom of their world was an altar. Whatever you believe, lying there in your bed tonight, there is something steadying in that. People under more pressure than we can readily imagine, deciding that the foundation stone of survival was hope and carving it accordingly. Higher up, on the second level, there's a long barrel-vaulted hall that the guides and Turkey's culture ministry call the missionary school, with little study rooms opening off it. Was it truly a school? The vault is real and rare. The label is tradition rather than proof. and I'll flag it as such. But it would fit. Sealed in a hill with your whole town and all of your children, you would want somewhere for the children to be. Possibly somewhere with a door you can close behind you. Some truths about parenting are constant across 12 centuries. Here's where I level with you about what the record holds and what it doesn't. We have the rooms. We don't have the voices. Nobody who sheltered in Derinkuyu wrote down what a night inside was like. Or if they did, it hasn't survived. History kept the architecture and lost the diary, which is history's most reliable habit. So everything tender you'll ever read about life down there, the murmur of prayers through tunnels, children learning to walk in lamplight, the particular sound of 1,000 families being quiet together, all of it is imagination, mine included. The honest inventory is smaller and stranger. We know the lamps existed because the niches and the oil presses survive. We know where people slept only roughly and not who slept where. No family's name attaches to any room. Were children born down there in the long stays? Almost certainly across centuries of use. And not one such birth is recorded anywhere. We know they were organized. A city this coherent doesn't happen to a mob, but no roster, no census, no record of a single individual among the thousands survives from below. Not one name in 12 centuries of use. A whole civilization's worth of patience, and the patience is the only signature they left. What you can do, tonight, in the dark, which is the correct laboratory for this, is the simple human arithmetic. Footsteps on stone, lamp shadow on a curved wall, the draft from a shaft you can hear but not see. Somewhere above, muffled beyond 18 meters of rock, weather. It would have been frightening at first, then ordinary. Humans can make anything ordinary. It's our most underrated talent. And then, eventually, it begins to feel safe. The dark that hides you stops being the dark you're afraid of. Now widen the picture, because Derinkuyu, impossibly, is not unique. It isn't even rare. Across this one Turkish region, more than 200 underground settlements have been found. 200, at least 2 levels deep, with around 40 going 3 levels or more. The plains are honeycombed, whole villages with second secret shelves. Derinkuyu is simply the deepest and grandest we've opened. The one that got famous because one wall in one house happened to come down in 1963. Statistically speaking, there are many more walls hiding secrets. 10 kilometers north sits Kaymaklı, another underground city, wider and shallower, opened to visitors a year before Derinkuyu was. Same period, same builder's logic, same stone doors. Sister cities in every sense. And here is where I owe you tonight's biggest act of honesty. Almost every article about Derinkuyu will tell you, somewhere around paragraph 4, that an 8 or 9 kilometer tunnel connects it to Kaymaklı, a buried road between buried cities. And it would be wonderful. It would also be, as far as the actual record goes, unverified. The claim circulates everywhere and is sourced almost nowhere. No survey maps it end to end. No one in the modern era has walked it. So the famous connection between the two cities remains, for now, a rumor 10 kilometers long. I'd argue the truth is better than the rumor. The rumor says, someone dug a very long tunnel. The truth says, we have explored these cities for 60 years and still cannot answer a yes or no question about where their passages go. A tenth of Derinkuyu is lit. The rest is the dark side of the moon, 10 minutes walk from a ticket booth. Here's the turn in the story almost nobody tells, because the buried city gets all the press. There were long stretches when the people of the village got to come above ground. Between the raiding centuries, the Byzantine Empire would push the frontier back and hold it, sometimes for generations at a time. And when the land was safe, the people of Cappadocia surfaced. The underground cities went quiet. The stone doors stood open and unneeded. Life moved back into the sun where it belonged. But here's what they did next, and I find it tells you everything about who these people had become. They kept carving. A people who had spent centuries learning to think with a chisel did not stop thinking with a chisel just because the emergency was over. They simply turned the skill toward the light. In the valleys at Göreme and Soanle, they cut churches into the cliff faces and the fairy chimneys. Hundreds of them, hollowed out of the same volcanic tuff, with columns and domes and arches, all of it carved rather than built. And this time, with no raiders to hide from, they decorated. Frescoes in blues and golds and reds, saints and angels across carved ceilings, color blooming on rock in broad daylight. Look at the two halves of it together. Underground, bare walls, no inscriptions, no names. Invisibility as a survival strategy. Above ground, in peacetime. Painted ceilings you can see across a valley. Same people, same rock, same handwriting, signed and unsigned. The underground city is what their skill looked like when they were afraid. The painted churches are what it looked like the moment they no longer had to be. If you want to know what those anonymous diggers would have made, given peace and permission, it's standing in the Göreme Valley right now, wearing 800 years of pigment. And whenever the dust rose on the horizon again, and across those centuries it always eventually rose, they put down the paintbrush, picked the children up, and went back downstairs. Both cities, the bright one and the dark one, stayed ready. That was the actual masterpiece. Not either city, but the people who could live in both. The Arab raids that built the deep city eventually ended, the way all weather ends. The frontier moved. The stones stayed. And then history kept arriving, and the town kept going downstairs. When the armies of Timur, Tamerlane, tore through Anatolia around the year 1400, the old chronicles and the village memory agree. The Christians of Cappadocia went underground again, into refuges their ancestors had cut 6 centuries earlier, and the doors still rolled, and the wells still drew. Try to name another piece of infrastructure that worked perfectly 600 years after installation. The vents did not need updating. The stone did not need a subscription. Under the Ottomans, the centuries mostly quieted, but the habit never quite died. The Greek-speaking villages of Malakopea, descendants in language and faith of the people who dug, kept the lowest habit of their ancestors. When trouble came, you knew where the stairs were. They had a word for the underground places, kataphigia, refuges, not a monument word, a word you keep in the kitchen drawer in case. It lasted until 1923. After the war between Greece and Turkey, the two countries agreed to exchange their minority populations. A line in a treaty, and suddenly whole worlds were folded up like tents. The Greek Christians of Malakopea, the last community that still carried the living memory of what lay beneath their floors and what it was for, packed what could be packed and left for a country many of them had never seen. The doors of their houses closed. The doors under their houses had already been closed a long time. Memory, it turns out, is the one thing you can't store in a cellar. Grain keeps. Wine keeps. The knowledge of what the doors were for went where the people went, onto the ships in 1923. Now, before we get to the forgetting history part, and the forgetting history part is coming, I want to show you the strangest footnote in this whole affair. Because the knowledge didn't vanish all at once. Before the last people who carried it left, a stranger with a notebook wrote it down, in English, through a university press. And then it sat on library shelves for 47 years, while the world forgot the thing it said. Between 1909 and 1911, that Cambridge scholar I mentioned, Dawkins, the one with the arrow story, travelled village to village through Cappadocia. He wasn't hunting cities, he was hunting words. The Greek spoken in these valleys was ancient, isolated, and dying, and he wanted it on paper before it went. So he sat with the villagers of these towns, Malakopea among them, and wrote down their language, and along with the language, inevitably, came the life, including the fact, which he recorded and published in 1916, that the Greek villagers of this region kept underground refuges, the kataphagia, and had sheltered in them from trouble within living memory. Now line the dates up, because this is the part I genuinely cannot get over. 1916. The underground refuges of Cappadocia are described in print in a Cambridge University press book that any library could order. 1923. The villagers leave, and the living memory goes with them. 1963. A man knocks down his cellar wall in Derinkuyu, and the world is astonished. Surveys, ministries, headlines astonished by a discovery that had been available in English in university libraries the whole time. Nobody had cross-referenced the footnote with the floor plan. In fairness to everyone involved, check whether the linguistics monograph mentions our basement has never appeared on any renovation checklist, which tells you something useful about how things actually get lost. Almost never, because nobody wrote them down. Somebody nearly always writes them down. They get lost because the man holding the hammer and the man holding the book never meet. Somewhere in tonight's world, presumably, the next Derinkuyu is already written down, fully documented, correctly filed, in a book nobody has thought to cross-reference yet. Sleep on that one. So here is the fact I find more remarkable than the depth, the doors, or the well. The fact this whole episode has secretly been about. For roughly 40 years, the town of Derinkuyu, the new town, the families who settled there after the exchange, lived an ordinary Anatolian life directly on top of the largest known underground city on Earth and didn't even know it. They weren't fools. Never think that. They knew their cellars were old and odd, They kept onions in carved rooms, stabled animals in others, felt the strange, cool draft from cracks at the back, and reasonably assumed what anyone would: old caves. Every old town has old holes. Nobody looks at the back of their own cellar and thinks, could this be the entrance to an ancient, forgotten underground civilization? The surface of the deep city simply went on working as storage, as it had always partly been, while the 17 floors beneath it slipped out of human knowledge entirely. The city was so good at hiding that, with its keepers gone, it hid from everyone, indefinitely, without effort. A city built to vanish, and for those 40 years, for the first time in its 12th-century career, it finally, completely had. And then a man took a hammer to a wall, and the world's most patient secret met the world's most universal activity: renovating. The plains had kept the city the way old men keep grudges, completely and without visible strain, and gave it up to a home improvement project on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. Since then, surveys, tourists, a place on the UNESCO World Heritage List alongside the fairy chimneys above it. 90% of it remains unlit and unvisited. Whatever else is down there is exactly where it's been all along. One more thing before we put the lamp out. Because if any part of you is hoping this story isn't over, I have good news. The plane isn't done. In 2013, in the city of Nevşehir, the provincial capital, half an hour up the road, municipal crews were demolishing old housing around the hilltop castle to make way for new construction. The bulldozers broke through into tunnels. The tunnels led to rooms. The rooms kept going. Archaeologists were called in, and by 2014 they were saying carefully, in the way of people trying not to get ahead of themselves, that the city under Nevşehir might be bigger than Derinkuyu. Bigger, if you can believe it, found the same way, by accident, from above, by people who were trying to do something else entirely. Twice now, in living memory, Cappadocia has produced an entire lost city because somebody disturbed the ground at the right spot. 200 underground settlements confirmed, and the true count? Well, nobody will commit to a true count. Every old town on this plain sits on old rooms. Every old cellar has a back wall. And the region has a now established habit of keeping 18-story secrets through sheer geological calm. Somewhere out there tonight, on that plain, is a wall with a city behind it that nobody has asked about yet. The discovery scoreboard so far reads, found by renovation, 1. Found by demolition, 1. Found by deliberately looking, 0. The next lost city in Cappadocia is, in all likelihood, currently moonlighting as the back of somebody's cellar. So here you are. You made it down all 18 stories, and the lamps burning low, which is as it should be. Every monument in history was built to be seen. The pyramids advertise. The Colosseums announce. Every palace ever raised is a sentence that begins with, "Look at me." And we duly looked and wrote down the king's names and called it history. Derinkuyu is the opposite object, the only kind of wonder that succeeds by being unseen. Its builder's victory condition was your ignorance. By that measure, It may be the most successful structure on Earth. It worked so well we lost it. It hid so well it outlived the very memory that it was hiding. Spare a quiet thought, then, for the people history kept no names for. The first digger, whoever they were, scraping at soft ash rock with a hand tool and a notion. The Byzantine farmers who spent their winters deepening a hole they prayed they'd never need, and needed, and survived because of. The mothers counting children by lamplight while cavalry crossed overhead like weather. The last Greek grandmother of Malacopea on a ship in 1923, carrying the knowledge of the stairs in a language the town would eventually stop speaking. Not one of their names survives. Everything else they were, the patience, the stubbornness, the refusal to be erased, is still standing, 85 meters of it, and now you know it's there. They never wanted to be remembered. They wanted to be safe, and remembered was the price they paid for it 12 centuries late. I think they'd take the deal again. And you, there in your bed, you're on the surface, where it's quiet. No riders on your horizon. Your doors are lighter than half a ton and lock all the same. The only thing under your floor is floor. You are, by the standards of everyone in tonight's story, almost unimaginably safe. Safe enough to spend an hour underground for fun and fall asleep there. So, let the lamp go out. The stone doors are rolled shut. The well is cool and deep, and the air is still drifting down the shafts and through the dark rooms, the way it has for 1,000 years, whether or not anyone remembers. And tonight, somebody remembers. Sleep well. You made it through. Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, on a bright afternoon in December of 1872, there is a ship sailing along with nobody aboard. Her sails are up, not all of them, and not neatly, but enough to keep her moving. She is steering a slightly drunken, wandering course, the way a ship does when there is no hand on the wheel. The sun is out. The sea is an ordinary grey-blue, and there is not a single living person anywhere on her deck. The ship's name is the Mary Celeste. She is a small American merchant ship, and 9 days ago there were 10 people on board. A captain, his wife, their daughter, and 7 crewmen. Right now, none of them are here. Their belongings are. Their food is 6 months of it, still sitting in the stores. The cargo is still sitting exactly where it was loaded days ago. The only thing missing, besides the people, is the ship's one small lifeboat. Now, you have almost certainly heard of this ship. And here is the strange part. Almost everything you've heard about it is wrong. What happened to the 10 people who were on board? Why would everyone aboard leave, when at first glance everything seems perfectly normal? Was it pirates? Was it a sea monster, the way the storytellers wanted it to be? Or was it something quieter and sadder, and a great deal more human than any of that? And why is the most famous fact about this ship, the one absolutely everybody knows, a story a young novelist simply made up 12 years after it happened? We'll get to all of that soon. But before we set out, If these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. And we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if you have a theory of your own about the Mary Celeste, and by the end of tonight you may have a few, leave it down in the comments. I read them, usually somewhere around 2 in the morning. So before we go any further, let's get comfortable. Dim the lights, pull the blanket up, tuck your feet in, and let's go out to the middle of the Atlantic, to a sunlit, empty deck, and find out what really happened, and what only got told. It is the 4th of December, 1802, a little after 1 in the afternoon. About 400 miles off the Azores, a small cluster of Portuguese islands sitting alone out in the open Atlantic, another ship is going about her business. She's called the Dei Gratia, a Canadian-built merchant ship under a captain named David Morehouse, and she's bound from New York to Gibraltar with a hold full of petroleum. The man at the wheel notices a sail a few miles off. Nothing alarming about that. But as the two ships draw closer, the men on the Dei Gratia start to frown. The other ship is moving wrong. Her sails are set badly, some up, some missing, a couple just hanging loose. She wanders back and forth across the wind, the way a horse wanders when it works out that nobody's holding the reins. They watch her for 2 hours. In all that time, not one person appears on her deck. Nobody touches a sail. Nobody waves. Nobody comes to the rail to look back at them. So Captain Morehouse does the thing any sailor would do. He sends a boat across. 2 of his men, his mate, a steady fellow named Oliver Deveau, and the second mate, climb up onto the deck of the silent ship, and they find nothing. Or rather, they find everything except the one thing they're looking for. They find no people. The deck is wet and a bit of a mess. There's water down in the hold, about 3.5 feet of it, which sounds alarming until you remember that this is a wooden sailing ship in December. And 3.5 feet of water in the bottom of one of those is roughly the maritime version of a damp basement. Annoying, worth pumping out, not a reason to abandon the building. One of the ship's 2 pumps has been taken apart. A length of rope is trailing over the side, down into the sea. The compass box has been knocked off its stand, and its glass is broken. Down in the cabin, it's stranger still, precisely because it's so ordinary. The captain's bunk, charts and papers, a sword lying in its scabbard under the bed, which is going to matter enormously to a very silly man in a little while, so do hold on to it. The crew's clothes, folded and left. 6 months of food and fresh water in the stores. The whole cargo, barrel after barrel, sitting untouched. Everything a person needs to stay alive is here. The persons are not. And lashed across one of the hatches there is an empty space and some cut rope where the ship's single small lifeboat, a little open boat called a yawl, used to be. It is gone. Wherever the 10 people went, they went in that boat, and they took the ship's papers with them and the captain's navigation instruments. They did not take their coats. They did not take their food. They left in a hurry, but not in a blind, screaming panic, because they stopped to grab the documents that mattered before they climbed down into the boat. And then the ship they left behind did something nobody expected. She kept going. For 9 days, with not one person aboard, she sailed herself across hundreds of miles of open Atlantic. Didn't sink, didn't roll over, just calmly carried on, like an employee who never got the message that the company had closed. Now, here I have to do something slightly annoying, which is to take a wonderful story away from you before I hand you a truer one. Because if you already knew the tale of the Mary Celeste before tonight, the version in your head probably goes something like this. A ghost ship, found drifting and dead silent. And down in the cabin, this is the famous part, a meal still sitting on the table. Cups of tea, still warm. A breakfast half eaten, as though the crew had simply vanished mid-bite. A pot still steaming on the stove. A slice of pie with a forkful gone. Washing hung out to dry on the deck. And, in some tellings, a cat, asleep and perfectly content on a locker, the only living thing left to see whatever unspeakable thing had happened. It's a fantastic image. Genuinely. It has everything. The warmth still in the teacup, the people gone in a heartbeat, the cozy little scene frozen at the exact second the world ended for everyone in it. There is just one small problem with it, which is that essentially none of it is true. There was no warm tea. There was no half-eaten breakfast. There was no pie, no washing on the line, and there was, I'm sorry to report, no cat. We know this because the man who actually climbed aboard, the mate Oliver DeVoe, stood up in a courtroom a few weeks later and said so, under oath. His words were that there were, quote, no preparations for eating and nothing to eat or drink in the cabin. No meal, no set table, nothing. And even if there had been, even if there'd been a full roast dinner laid out under a little dome, it could not possibly have been warm. Because the last entry written in the ship's log was 10 days old by the time anyone found her. 10 days. You could leave a cup of tea sitting out for 10 days, come back, and find that it has developed a thick skin, a strong smell, and possibly some opinions. Nothing on that ship was steaming. So where did the warm tea come from? Where did the cat come from? Hold that question, because the answer is one of my favorite things in this entire story, and it involves a very famous author you have absolutely heard of, behaving in a way that would get him sued today. But before we get to the man who made all of that up, I want to do the thing the legend never bothers to do. I want to tell you who was actually on the ship, because they were real people, and they deserve better than to be furniture in a ghost story. The captain was a man named Benjamin Briggs. He was 37, from Massachusetts, one of 5 brothers who all went to sea. It was that kind of family. By every account, he was a careful, serious man. He read his Bible. He didn't drink. He was the sort of captain other people trusted, and he trusted himself for good reason, because he had been doing this his whole life. And he wasn't only the captain of the Mary Celeste. He'd put his own money into her. He was a part owner. In a real sense, this was his ship. With him was his wife, Sarah. They had been married 10 years. And with the 2 of them was their daughter, Sophia, who was 2 years old. They had another child as well, a little boy named Arthur, who was 7. Arthur was not on the ship. He'd been left at home with his grandmother because he was old enough now for school, and you don't pull a 7-year-old out of school to spend 2 months crossing the ocean. That decision, small, ordinary, sensible, to leave the older child home for the school term, is the only reason there is anyone left in this family at all. Remember Arthur? We'll come back to him. And then there was the crew. 7 men, hand-picked by Briggs himself, because a careful captain chooses careful men. His first mate, Albert Richardson, he knew and trusted personally. There was a second mate, a steward who did the cooking, and 4 German sailors, among them 2 brothers, Volkert and boy Lorenzen. 10 people, a family, and the men they sailed with. That is who was on the Mary Celeste. Not a ghost story. A small floating town of 10 people out on the water together. So let's go back to the start of the voyage before any of it went wrong, when it was just an ordinary job. In early November of 1872, the Mary Celeste was tied up at a pier on the East River in New York, taking on her cargo. And the cargo is worth knowing about, because it matters later. She was carrying 1,700 barrels of alcohol. Not the drinking kind. This was raw industrial alcohol, the sort used in factories, bound for Genoa, in Italy, where it was going to be used in the making of wine. Briggs supervised the loading himself, barrel after barrel, down into the hold. While the ship was loading, Briggs wrote a letter to his mother. It's a completely ordinary letter, the kind of quick note you'd send today just to say all is well. But one line of it has survived, and it's a little hard to read now, knowing what's coming. He wrote, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage." In beautiful trim. He was proud of his ship. He thought she was in lovely shape. He was looking forward to a good crossing. They were meant to leave on the 5th of November, but Briggs didn't like the look of the weather. So he did the careful thing, the thing he always did, and anchored just off Staten Island and waited 2 days for it to settle. And during that wait, his wife Sarah wrote a letter too, to her mother-in-law back home. In it, she mentions Arthur, the little boy they'd left behind. She writes, "Tell Arthur I make great dependence on the letters I shall get from him." She is telling her 7-year-old, through his grandmother, that she is counting on his letters, that she wants to hear from him while she's away. It is the most ordinary, most human line in this entire story. A mother, about to be out of reach for 2 months, asking her little boy to please write to her. On the 7th of November, the weather cleared, and the Mary Celeste sailed out into the open Atlantic. The last thing anyone ever wrote in her logbook was a plain position note on the morning of the 25th of November. It placed her right beside a small island in the Azores called Santa Maria. After that, the log is blank. Whatever happened to the 10 people on board happened somewhere past that quiet, ordinary morning. Out beyond the last island, in open water, with no one else around for hundreds of miles. So picture the spot Captain Morehouse of the Dei Gratia is now in. He's in the middle of the ocean, and he has just found a perfectly good ship with nobody on it. By the law of the sea, a ship found abandoned like that is salvage. If you can bring her safely into port, you're owed a reward, often a healthy share of what the ship and her cargo are worth. So this is, potentially, a very good day for Captain Morehouse. But it's also a problem, because he now has 2 ships and only 1 crew. So he splits his men. He sends his mate Deveau and 2 sailors back aboard the Mary Celeste to sail her, keeps the rest on his own ship, and the 2 vessels set off together for the nearest sensible port, which is Gibraltar, the great rock at the mouth of the Mediterranean, about 600 miles away. They make it in just under 2 weeks, the 4-man skeleton crew nursing the silent ship the whole way, and they come into Gibraltar in the middle of December. And this is the point where the story should simply have ended. A ship found empty, brought safely into port, the salvage men paid, the whole thing filed under "The ocean is enormous and sometimes a thing happens out on it that is never fully explained." That is how it should have gone. It is not how it went, because waiting in Gibraltar was a man who looked at this sad, soggy, empty little ship and saw the crime of the century. His name, and I promise you I am not inventing this, was Frederick Solly Flood. He was the Attorney General of Gibraltar, which is a very grand title, and he had a personality built to match it. One historian who studied the case later described him as a man whose, quote, "arrogance and pomposity were inversely proportional to his IQ," which is a beautifully polite way of saying the less he understood about a thing, the more certain of himself he became. And Frederick Solly Flood was certain that the Mary Celeste was the scene of a terrible crime. He had theories. Oh, he had theories. Perhaps the crew had broken into the alcohol cargo, gone mad with drink, murdered the captain and his family, and fled. Perhaps Captain Morehouse and the men of the Dei Gratia had crept up on the Mary Celeste, killed everyone aboard, and invented the whole "we found her abandoned" story to collect the salvage money. Murder, mutiny, conspiracy. Solly Flood was open to all of them, so long as it was a crime, because a man does not get this excited about a damp basement and some missing rope. So he investigated for 3 months, and he went looking for evidence of a slaughter with the tireless energy of a man who has already decided exactly what he is going to find. He found the sword, the one under the captain's bunk. I told you to hold on to it. He drew it out, and there were stains on the blade, and Solly Flood knew, that he was looking at dried blood. He found dark marks cut into the timbers of the hull near the bow, and he became convinced they'd been made with an axe or a blade. Signs of violence, evidence of the massacre. He had it. He had his crime. And then he made the fatal mistake of letting people who actually knew things look at his evidence. The stains on the sword were sent off to be properly analyzed. They were not blood. They were rust, with perhaps a trace of something like spilled lemon. The sinister cuts on the hull were examined by a captain from the United States Navy, who took one look and explained that they were entirely natural, just the ordinary way the sea works at the timbers of a wooden ship over the years. Not an axe, not a blade. Water and wood and time. Every single piece of Frederick Solly Flood's great murder case turned out to be the nautical equivalent of being startled in the dark by your own coat hanging on the back of a door. He spent 3 months hunting killers, and what he had actually found was rust, weathering, and his own imagination. In the end, he had to let the ship go. Though he never quite let the suspicion go The salvage reward the De Gratia men finally received was unusually small, a quiet little insult from officials who couldn't prove a thing but didn't want to look as though they'd missed one. So if the warm tea and the sleeping cat were in nobody's courtroom testimony, if the real evidence was rust and weathered wood, then where did the ghost ship come from? Where did all those gorgeous, specific, utterly invented little details come from? They came from a 24-year-old doctor who wasn't a very busy doctor yet, and who was earning a bit of extra money on the side by writing stories. His name was Arthur Conan Doyle. Yes, that one. The man who, a few years later, would invent Sherlock Holmes. In 1884, 12 years after the Mary Celeste was found empty, Doyle published a short story. He published it anonymously in a magazine, written as a first-person account by a survivor of the abandoned ship, telling the true tale of what had happened aboard. It was fiction. Complete fiction. He took the real, genuinely strange case and he decorated it. He added the perfectly set breakfast table. He added the abandoned mid-meal feeling. He built a dramatic, entirely invented plot of murder and revenge on top of it. He gave the public the spooky, satisfying ghost ship that the real, soggy facts had stubbornly refused to provide. And he made two changes that tell you everything you need to know. The rescuing ship, the De Gratia, he left almost exactly as she was. He kept her name perfectly correct. But the famous ship, the empty one, he renamed. He called her the Mary Celeste. Marie, spelled the French way, with an IE on the end. The real ship was the Mary Celeste. Mary, the plain English name. And here is the part I find genuinely remarkable. Doyle's made-up French misspelling, Marie Celeste, became, for the next 100 years, the way most of the world spelled and said the name of this ship. The fiction was so much more popular than the facts that it quietly painted over them. People learned the wrong name from a short story and then taught the wrong name to their children. It got worse, or better, depending on how you feel about these things. Doyle's story was so convincing that a newspaper, the Boston Herald, actually reprinted it as a true news report, a work of fiction printed in the paper as fact. And there are accounts that even our friend Frederick Solly Flood, the great investigator himself, read Doyle's little story and took parts of it seriously, which raises the lovely possibility that the official who investigated the real ship ended up muddled by a tale a novelist made up about her. After Doyle, the gates were open and everyone piled in. Over the years, people decided the Mary Celeste had been attacked by a giant squid, or struck by a freak wave that washed every soul off the deck, but somehow left the breakfast untouched, or that it was aliens, or sea monsters, or a curse. Eventually, and she vanished nowhere near the place, people began filing her under the Bermuda Triangle, which is the folklore equivalent of blaming anything you can't explain on the one spooky thing you happen to have heard of. It became a kind of theory circus, and the thing about a circus is that it's a great deal of fun, and none of it is real. And meanwhile, the 10 actual people who climbed down into that little boat have been quietly buried under 100 years of squid. So let's sweep the squid and the curse and the French misspelling off the table and ask the real question. The quiet one, underneath all the noise. If there was no crime, and no monster, and no warm tea, then what actually happened to Benjamin Briggs, his family, and his crew? We don't know for certain. We never will. No bodies were ever found. The little boat was never found. There is no last page of the log to tell us. And anyone who claims to know exactly what happened on that ship is doing precisely what Conan Doyle did, making up a good story. But we can make a careful guess from the real clues the boarding party actually found. It's only a theory. It just happens to be the one nearly everyone who studies this case ends up landing on, and the kind of guess Captain Briggs himself would have respected. Remember the things aboard that ship that didn't quite fit? One of the pumps had been taken apart. A sounding rod, a tool for measuring how much water is down in the hold, was lying out on the deck, as if someone had been urgently checking the level. There were a few feet of water below, and the cargo was 1,700 barrels of alcohol, 9 of which were later found to be empty. They had leaked. Now stand for a moment where Briggs was standing. You are a careful captain, and you become aware of 2 frightening things at once. There is water in your hold and a pump that isn't working properly, so you can't easily tell how fast you're taking it on. And a bad reading off that sounding rod could make it look as if you're sinking far faster than you really are. And at the very same time, you may be smelling alcohol fumes rising up out of the hold from those leaking barrels. In an age before anyone properly understood how and when fumes like that might catch and explode. You are standing on a wooden ship that might be filling with water and might also be about to blow up. So you make a decision, not a wild one, a careful one, the sort you have trained for your whole life. You put your wife, your 2-year-old daughter, and your 7 crewmen into the ship's small boat. You tie the small boat to the ship with a rope so you won't lose her, and you pull off a short distance, and you wait. You wait to see whether the ship is going to sink or burn or simply settle down and be fine. It is the sensible plan. Stay close. Stay tied on. Ride out the danger in the boat and climb back aboard once it passes. And then the one thing you did not plan for happens. The wind comes up. The rope joining the little boat to the ship parts, snaps, or has to be cut in the rising sea. And in a moment, the gap between the small open boat and the big ship begins to open, and it keeps opening, because the ship still has sails set, and the small boat has 10 frightened people and a pair of oars. The Mary Celeste sails away from them, calmly, steadily, exactly the way we watched her sail at the very beginning of tonight's story. Except now there are 10 people in an open boat behind her, watching their ship, their food, their shelter, their entire chance of living, shrink against the horizon and go. They were off the Azores, in the open Atlantic, in December, in a small open boat, a real family, and 7 real men. Almost certainly, they drowned. The most likely reason is not a curse and not a crime. It's that a good captain made a reasonable decision on bad information and was unlucky with the weather. That is the whole monster in the end. The wind and a frayed rope and a few feet of water that may not even have been as dangerous as it looked. And the ship herself? You'd think a vessel with a story like that would be owed a story-like ending. A grand one. lost in a storm with all her mysteries still aboard, perhaps, or quietly retired and remembered. She got nothing so kind. After Gibraltar, the Mary Celeste was a marked ship. Word had gone round. She was the ship where everyone vanished, the unlucky one, the one nobody wanted. Sailors are superstitious, and owners are practical, and a ship with a reputation like that is hard to crew and hard to make money with. She changed hands again and again, and she lost money for nearly everyone who touched her for 13 years. And then, in 1885, she fell into the hands of a captain named Gilman Parker. And Gilman Parker looked at this famous, unlucky, money-losing ship, and he had an idea. Not a romantic idea, a grubby one. He loaded her up with a cargo that he insured for far, far more than it was actually worth. By the accounts, it was largely junk, dressed up on paper as something valuable. And then he deliberately sailed the Mary Celeste onto a coral reef off the coast of Haiti. On purpose. He wrecked her so that he could collect the insurance money on a cargo that had never been worth much at all. It is about the least mysterious thing a person can do to a ship. It is just fraud. The famous ghost ship, the vessel of 1,000 sea monster theories, was killed on purpose for a cheap insurance scam by a man trying to make a quick and dishonest dollar. And it didn't even work. The scheme was clumsy, and it came apart, and Gilman Parker was put on trial in Boston, not only for fraud, but for a crime with the wonderful old name of barratry, which, when it means wrecking a ship on purpose like this, was once serious enough that a man could hang for it. Parker didn't hang. The jury couldn't agree, and the case was settled out. But he was finished, ruined, disgraced, his money and his good name gone. He died in poverty just a few months later. And the ship's real logbook, the one with the real final entries, was lost around the same time. Which is the reason that, to this very day, the only surviving record of the Mary Celeste's last course is a copy made by none other than Frederick Solly Flood, the pompous prosecutor who got everything else about her wrong. So that is the true ending. Not a ghost ship sailing on forever into the mist. A tired old vessel run up onto a reef on purpose for the insurance money by a man who died broke for having done it. The legend is grander, I'll give it that. But this, the cheap, sad, ordinary human truth of it, is what actually happened. And that is the Mary Celeste. Not the version with the warm tea and the sleeping cat. That one belongs to a young writer with a magazine deadline. The real one is quieter and sadder, and in its own way far stranger. 10 ordinary people who did a sensible thing and were lost for it. A ship that sailed herself across the ocean and was then wrecked on purpose for a few dishonest dollars. And a mystery that turned out to be made not of monsters, but of weather and rust, and the stories people couldn't stop telling about her. There is one piece of it I want to leave you with, though, the closest thing this story has to a mercy. Remember Arthur, the little boy, 7 years old, left home with his grandmother so he wouldn't miss the school term, because his parents made that small, ordinary, sensible decision. Arthur was not on the ship. He grew up. He lived a long life. The family that went out onto the water did not all go. One of them stayed home by chance and a school calendar and carried on. We don't get to know the last hours of the people in that little boat. No one does, and no one ever will. But we don't have to be frightened of it, you and I, here, tonight, because wherever you are listening from, you are not in a small boat in a December ocean. You are warm. You are dry. You are still. The cold Atlantic is far away and 150 years in the past. And tonight, the only thing you have to do is let this quiet story carry you off to sleep. So let the ship go. Let her sail off the edge of the story, the same way she sailed off toward the horizon. Quiet, unbothered, and finally done. Let the questions stay unanswered. They're allowed to be. And let yourself rest. Sleep well, and we will be right here to do this for you again tomorrow night.